Etymologists, what is your favorite story of how a word came to be? Eavesdropping before the invention of guttering roofs were made with wide eaves, overhangs, so that rainwater would fall away from the house to stop the walls and foundations being damaged. This area was known as the eavesdrop. The large overhang gave good cover for those who wished to lurk in shadows and listen to others' conversations. Since the area under the eaves was considered part of the householder's property, you could be fined under Anglo-Saxon law for being under the eaves with the intention of spying.
It's interesting how the design of houses has some history behind it. Eaves were more than just architectural features. They were basically a privacy barrier. I mean, think about it. Someone could just be hanging out there, listening to conversations without anyone knowing. It's funny how laws even developed around that idea, making it a crime to be caught eavesdropping. Just shows how people have always had a knack for snooping around.
My favorite word origin is muscle, derived from the Latin word musculus, which translates to little mouse. When physicians were first observing the musculature, it is said that they remarked that the muscles in the biceps and calves, most notably, looked like mice running under the skin. Edit, grammar mistake. Thanks, Silax1.
That's an interesting tidbit. It's funny to think that muscles reminded people of little mice. I guess when you're observing something up close, you start to notice odd similarities. It's kind of quirky how language evolves like that. Makes you appreciate the words we use every day a bit more.
A lot of words filter down from the age of sail. The word scuttlebutt, for instance, was a cask, but kept near an opening, a scuttle, to the lower decks. Sailors could grab a drink of water from it and would natural gossip around it. It's identical to our use of the word water cooler talk to refer to gossip.
That's an interesting connection between the past and now. Scuttlebutt really shows how some traditions just stick around. I guess people have always liked to share stories and gossip, no matter the setting. It makes me think of times I've just hung out with friends and casually talked about everything going on. It's nice to see how some things never really change.
The words candidate and candid both come from the Latin candidus, meaning bright white. Orators/high-ranking Roman politicians would wear very clean, white togas when speaking to crowds to essentially show their trustworthiness. Thus, the English word candid's modern definition of honest or trustworthy ties back to the perceived honesty of politicians. Kind of funny when you look at politicians today.
It's interesting how language evolves. The connection between candidate and candid is a neat twist. Back in ancient Rome, looking clean and trustworthy really mattered. These days, we often find the opposite in politics. You'd think that would change how we see the words today. It just shows how history can influence what we expect from people in those roles. Makes you think about honesty as a whole.
The Yucatan Peninsula is so named because in one of the local languages, Yucatan means something along the lines of, "I can't understand you." I just imagine conquistadors landing, finding natives, and asking them, "What is this land called?" "I can't understand you." Yucatan it is. Edit. Full disclosure, conclusive etymology has not been established for the name. From what I've read, this theory seems to be quite plausible, but other plausible theories exist. Apologies for not adding this earlier.
That's an interesting take on the name. It's funny to think about how miscommunication shapes history. The conquistadors must have been confused, thinking they named the place when it was just a misunderstanding. It's wild how language can create such unique stories. It makes you wonder how much gets lost in translation over time. Life is kind of like that, isn't it? You never really know the full story.
The word pumpernickel. It's a dark rye bread, 1756, pumpernickel, from German, Westphalian dialect, pumpernickel, 1663, originally an abusive nickname for a stupid person, from pumper to break wind plus nickel goblin, laut, rascal, from proper name Niklaus, see Nicholas. An earlier German name for it was Krankbrot, literally sick bread. There is legend that the term was coined by Napoleon when he received a pumpernickel and replied that it's only good enough to feed it to his horse Nickel by saying, "Bon poor Nickel."
It's interesting how words evolve. Pumpernickel, the term, really started as an insult and ended up being a type of bread. Kind of funny to think Napoleon saw it as only fit for his horse. Imagine getting served that bread back in the day and knowing its origin. It's just bread now, but it has a whole story behind it, which makes it a bit more special. Simple details like that can change perspectives.
Dord, meaning density. It's less of a word actually used in conversation, and more of an etymological novelty, but I love it. When Webster's dictionary was copied by hand decades ago, one transcriber received a definition D or D, density. He misinterpreted the abbreviation as a complete word and copied Dord, density.
I guess it's funny how a simple mistake can create a word that's recognized, even if it's not really used. It reminds me of my friend trying to invent his own slang. He always mixes up words and ends up with something random that sticks for a bit. We laugh about it, but it's interesting how language evolves, even accidentally, like that Dord thing.
Quarantine comes from the Venetian quarantina, meaning 40. During the Black Death, ships were ordered to spend 40 days outside of Venetian ports. If the crew members didn't develop plague, after 40 days they entered Venice. If not, they likely were all dead. The Venetians likely would have just scuttled the vessels found to be infected.
It's interesting how quarantine has such a historical background. The idea of keeping ships at bay for 40 days really shows how serious they were about controlling disease. It's tough to think about the fate of those crew members, stuck with the fear of death while waiting. Those old practices had a major impact on modern health measures. It's a pretty heavy but crucial part of public health history.
Flammable, derived from underscore and flammable underscore meaning able to become inflamed. Makers of safety warnings for on the sides of trucks, canisters, etc. were afraid the public would think inflammable meant not flammable, thus undercutting the intention of the warning label, leading to the change. So, flammable and inflammable mean the same thing.
It's interesting how words can have such tricky meanings. I remember chatting with a friend who thought inflammable meant safe. We were at a gas station, and he saw the signs and was confused. I've always found language quirks like that amusing. It's a little surprising how much context matters. Just goes to show that understanding words can sometimes save you from a big misunderstanding.
I read the title as Etymologists, and then realized that I was incorrect after reading the first comment. But I'm going to answer anyways. There are so many proteins in the body that do a number of jobs, estimates between 50,000 to 100,000 types. Some of these proteins are called kinases. Kinases are responsible for adding a phosphate to a protein. My favorite kinase is called JK, which is short for just another kinase. Scientists are not always especially creative, but this cracks me up every time. On a side note, there is now JK1, JK2, and JK3.
This reminds me of a time I misread something at work. I thought we were presenting a new project called Innovators, but it turned out to be Innovations. I laughed it off, but that moment stuck with me. It's funny how one small mistake can lead to a completely different understanding. I get the humor in the kinase name too. Sometimes simple names are the best.
Thagomizer. A thagomizer is the spiked end to a stegosaurus tail. Well, it actually didn't have a name, just a description, for quite a long time, but no scientists really noticed or cared. Along comes Gary Larson, artist and writer of Far Side, and he jokingly names it a thagomizer in honor of Thag. Scientists thought it was hilarious and then actually adopted the name. So the spiky tail end on a stegosaurus is a thagomizer because an American comic artist thought it was funny, and scientists did as well.
It's funny how sometimes names come from unexpected places. I remember a friend who would always joke about random things. One day, he casually named a weird-looking plant in our garden after his favorite cartoon. Next thing you know, we all started calling it that, and it stuck. Just like the thagomizer, sometimes a good laugh can lead to something that lasts. Simple moments like that make for good memories.
Not an etymologist, and this word is Filipino. Here, we say appear/aper when we want to high five. Apparently, we misheard the Americans saying up here. For appear, LOL this next one hasn't been confirmed. I've had suspicions about it. Kill it means someone who is hyper or being annoying. We probably misheard Americans say cool it, and the word just stuck.
That's an interesting take on language evolution. Misheard phrases can really shape how we communicate. It's funny how appear came from up here and stuck. The culate one makes sense too. People often adapt language in their own way. It shows how cultures blend and evolve over time. It's a reminder that language is always changing, shaped by everyday interactions.
This isn't answering the question, but maybe I can get an answer here. Funny enough, I was wondering about this in a thread over in /r/horror. So to you etymologists, is there a word for when you mix up phrases? Like if I was to say, she's not the sharpest bulb in the pack of crayons, which is mixing up not the sharpest tool in the shed, brightest bulb in the chandelier, and not the brightest crayon in the box. Or someone else chimed in with it's not rocket surgery, which is combining it's not rocket science and it's not brain surgery.
There's definitely something amusing about mixing phrases. It happens often. I remember a friend once said, "He's the best thing since sliced bread at making a salad." Took me a second to catch it. It's just funny how we can blend sayings together without realizing. They just sort of mash into something odd but entertaining. Language is a little chaotic like that, you know? Makes for some good laughs.
I'm not an etymologist, however I like the origin of the czar, or czar or however else it's spelled. The word comes from the Caesars of ancient Rome. It's a contraction, if you prefer. It makes sense if you think about how the Caesars were the emperors of ancient Rome for generations, and how that would link to the word czar/czar.
That's an interesting take on the word. Czar. I guess a lot of terms have roots that connect to history. It's always cool to see how language evolves from such powerful figures. Kind of gives you a different perspective on leadership and authority through the ages. Language really does tell a story of its own.
So around the Industrial Revolution time in France, workers protested their terrible working conditions by throwing their shoes, sabots, into the machines to prevent them from working. Hence, sabotage, edit. So apparently this isn't true after all. Time to find a new go-to fun fact about words to share.
That's an interesting piece of history. I like how language evolves through stories, even if they're not always true. Sometimes, the fun facts we share end up having a twist. It kind of makes you think about how we all have our own versions of a story. I guess it's all about finding something new to talk about when the old ones fall short.
I like the origin of the French aujourd'hui, which means today. Hui is a weakened form of the Latin hodie. Today, itself a shortened form of hoc die, on this day. So hui means today, but is a pretty short and boring word for today. So it got expanded to the emphatic form aujourd'hui, which eventually became a word in its own right, but literally means on the day of today. The best part is that history is repeating itself. Certain people in certain parts of France have taken to saying aujourd'hui, on the day of today, to the annoyance of pedants everywhere.
It's interesting how language evolves. I remember a friend who used to over-explain basic words, just like this. "Oh, jour d'aujourd'hui" thing. He thought it made him sound smarter, but it just confused everyone. We laughed about it later. It's funny how little phrases can become a big deal without anyone really noticing. Sometimes simpler is better, but I guess that's the charm of language.
A bit late to the party, but I love guard. This word comes from French, as you can tell by the goo, marking a hard G. However, in French, this word was originally from English, ward. French doesn't use W, hence the change in pronunciation. So, the French borrowed a word and modified its spelling and pronunciation to fit their own language, and then the English just borrowed the modified version back. So, now we have the more general guard and guardian compared to ward and warden.
Language evolution is interesting. It shows how cultures influence each other. The way guard traveled from English to French and back again is a good example of that. It's funny to think about how words change over time. Makes you realize that language is alive and constantly adapting. My friend once pointed this out during a conversation about word origins, and it led to a long chat about other similar examples.
Nice. In fewer than 400 years, it has transformed from an insult into a compliment. In Old French, it meant careless, clumsy, silly, foolish. From there, it progressed to timid, then fussy, then dainty or delicate, then to precise or careful, then agreeable, and has ended up today as kind, thoughtful. For a while, nice was viewed similarly to how certain linguists view words such as cool and rad and groovy, or emoticons, or dialectical contractions such as ain't, an abominable mangling of the language. But eventually, even the nicest gave up the fight.
It's interesting how language evolves. A word can start with such a negative vibe and end up as a compliment. I remember when a friend called someone nice in a sarcastic way. Over time, we all just accepted it as a good thing. It's funny to think that even with all the changes, people still find new ways to judge language. In the end, nice has really become more meaningful.
Late to the party, but sure, why not the loo, bathroom? Maybe this is commonly known, but the loo originated from the term Gardaloo, which was used by the people of Edinburgh, who shouted it down to unsuspecting people walking below the windows. The person would then throw their waste out the window onto streets where it would run down to the lake. Gardaloo is the anglicized form of French gare, de, lo gare, doodle, which means beware of the water. Always enjoyed that one.
It's interesting how words evolve over time. I mean, loo sounds so normal now, but to think it used to warn people of something nasty falling from windows is wild. It's funny how language reflects history. You learn something like this, and it changes how you think about something basic. I guess that's why I enjoyed it too, just a simple reminder of the quirks of the past.
In Russian, you add ka to the end of noun to make it a diminutive. Like if you want to baby talk your daughter Misha, you call her Mishka. A cat kot becomes a kitty Kashka. It's a little fun way to refer to something endearingly, as if you think it's cute. Anyway, the Russian word for water is voda.
That's interesting. It's kind of nice how languages have these little quirks. Like turning something into a cuter version just by adding a suffix. I remember my friend used to call their dog Barka instead of just bark. It makes things feel more personal, you know? Just a subtle way to show affection without overdoing it. Language has its own charm.
Penguin is a good one. It comes from penguin, which is Welsh or Breton for whitehead. But penguins don't have white heads, you say. That's right, most of them don't. But they do look something like the extinct great auk, which did have a distinctive white patch on its head. The word penguin initially meant a great auk, and when Europeans first encountered the birds we now call penguins, they called them that as well.
That's interesting. I always thought the name was just about the way they look. It's funny how words evolve like that. The connection to the great auk makes sense, even if it seems a bit off now. Language is weird. I guess it shows how our understanding of animals changes over time. Just like how we might label things differently when we see them in a new light.
Do I have to be an actual etymologist? And does it have to be English? If no, the story goes that a governor of the Dutch Cape Colony had a Spanish wife who ate only cantaloupe for breakfast. The kitchen staff started calling this exotic fruit spanspek, Spanish bacon, and today's spanspek is only word for cantaloupe in Afrikaans.
That's a pretty interesting tidbit about language. It's funny how certain words evolve from cultural exchanges and personal stories. The connection between a governor's wife and a common fruit like cantaloupe shows how simple things can have deeper meanings. Spanspek is a unique example of how language adapts over time. It makes you think about all the words we use without knowing their origins.
I like the etymology for shit. It has the same root as the word scissors, shed and shear, skay. It basically means to cut, divide, or separate one thing from another. So shitting is separating feces from the body. And what is even more interesting is that science has the same root as well, because you use science to separate one thing from another or distinguish things from each other to gain knowledge. So shit and science are distant cousins. Every time you shit, there's a tiny bit of science in there.
That's an interesting connection. I never really thought about it like that. It's kind of funny how basic human functions and scientific concepts can share a common root. Makes you appreciate the little things, I guess. Life's pretty interconnected when you think about it. It's one of those random facts that just sticks with you. Kind of changes how you view both science and nature.
In Old England, poor people had dirt floors. With all the rain, it got muddy just inside the front door. People would put down dry grass or thresh just inside the door for people to wipe their feet on when they came in. Once it piled up too high, it would fall out when the door was opened. People started nailing a board on its edge along the inside bottom of the door, which held the thresh. It was a threshold, also where the tradition of carrying a bride over the threshold started.
That's a neat little tidbit. Didn't know the connection between a threshold and a bride being carried over it. Just shows how practical solutions from back then laid the groundwork for traditions we still have today. Makes you appreciate the history behind simple things.
Maverick. Some rancher with the name Maverick liked the idea of ranching more than actually doing it. So he didn't mark any of his cattle with any markings. So if they strayed from the herd, they were mavericks, and up for grabs Maverick dies, and the steers just scatter around the Great Plains. Whenever another rancher sees a maverick steer, it is up for grabs. So that's how Maverick came to mean lone wolf or a loose cannon cop on the edge.
It's interesting how that name comes to symbolize independence. Sounds like Maverick made a choice based on his ideals, not really thinking it through. His way of ranching had some unintended consequences. It's kind of ironic that by avoiding rules, he created a legacy that meant something entirely different. Just shows how actions can shape meaning over time.
Meek, we define it as a weakness, but the Greeks used it as a military term for their horses. The Greek word praus, was used to define a horse trained for battle. Wild stallions were brought down from the mountains and broken for riding. Some were used to pull wagons, some were raced, and the best were trained for warfare. They retained their fierce spirit, courage, and power, but were disciplined to respond to the slightest nudge or pressure of the rider's leg. They could gallop in a battle at 35 miles per hour and come to a sliding stop at a word. They were not frightened by arrows, spears, or torches. Then they were said to be meeked.
It's interesting how the concept of meekness flips depending on the context. I think about a friend who seems quiet, but when it matters, they can really step up. They're like those trained horses, strong, but calm. In tough situations, they keep it together while others might panic. It's a reminder that sometimes, the most effective strength is just knowing how to control it. There's power in that kind of composure.
Ucaligon, it's one of those oddly specific words. He lived in Troy and his house was set on fire. The word came to mean neighbor whose house is on fire. It was in use with that meaning at least as far back as the 1600s, so it's not some kind of fad novelty word. Incidentally, his name in Greek means doesn't worry. So you think of a Ucaligon as someone whose house is burning to the ground and he doesn't give a shit about it.
That's an interesting take on the word. It's funny how language evolves. Ucaligon really describes that person who stays calm no matter the chaos around them. Imagine having your house burned down and just not caring. It's kind of surreal. I guess some people just handle stress differently, like they see things in a different light. It's a reminder to maybe not sweat the small stuff too much.
In cryptography, the two people sending and receiving messages are usually called Alice and Bob, because their names begin with A and B. So it makes sense for the third malicious person trying to grab their communications to have a name beginning with C. It is, however, standard to call her Eve, coming from eavesdropper.
That's an interesting tidbit. It's funny how in tech jargon, names can hold a deeper meaning or backstory. Alice and Bob are basically the classic duo in cryptography. And then there's Eve lurking around. Makes you think about how much goes on behind the scenes when you send a message. Shows the importance of security, too.
Also, toe rag, affectionate term a grandparent would call a misbehaving small child. Originally the frayed end of a rope dangling into the water at the head of the ship, used for cleaning one's backside. Not enough room to swing a cat, referring to an enclosed space. Reference to the Cat O' Tails, a whip with 9 knotted ends that was used to punish sailors. Square meal. In the age of fighting sailors required up to 5,000 calories a day with all the manual labor. They were given stodgy, large meals served on square wooden plates, slash boards for easy storage and harder to break. So the term became synonymous with a good meal. I could go on all day, but these are my favorite. Thank you, Opie, for such a thoughtful question. A very interesting thread.
I remember chatting with a friend about old sayings and what they really mean. We ended up laughing about toe rag and how it sounds kind of cute for a naughty kid. Then we talked about not enough room to swing a cat. It just paints a picture of how cramped life could be back then. We also appreciated the idea behind square meal and how sailors had to eat well to keep up their strength. Simple but interesting stuff.
Has anyone here heard of canoe? It stands for the Committee to Ascribe a Nautical Origin to Everything. It's an in-joke amongst people interested in etymology. For every other phrase in English, there's some explanation that links it to our seafaring heritage, and it's the job of canoe to make sure they stick.
I haven't heard of canoe before. It sounds like a fun concept, though. Friends and I used to joke about how everything has some historic origin. We'd come up with ridiculous explanations for everyday phrases. It's interesting how language evolves and connects to our past. I guess it shows how we like to attach stories to everything, even if they don't really make sense.
Sailor here, and one that really bugs me. When someone finds a contradiction and says that doesn't jive with what? The phrase is really that doesn't jive with. Jibe, or jibe, in the UK, is a sailing maneuver that requires good coordination between the person steering and the sailors handling the sails. It becomes a mess if the crew doesn't jibe with the helmsman.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. It's interesting how people mix up phrases without realizing it. I had a friend who did the same thing with another saying. They just kept saying it wrong, and it drove me a bit crazy. I tried to correct them, but they just laughed it off. Sometimes you just let those things slide, I guess. It's not worth getting worked up over language quirks.
Ooh, I know one. In Russian, the bell on a ship is called a runda. Rinda. At its inception, the Russian Navy was adapted using the British model to the point where even the orders were supposed to be given out in English. The command for ringing the bell was, well, ring the bell, which after some time morphed into a single word that stayed on after they switched to Russian as the language of operation.
That's an interesting bit of history about the Russian Navy. It's funny how language can adapt over time, especially when different cultures blend. A simple command turned into something unique. Just shows how traditions evolve, even in practical things like ship operations. Language quirks like that can really highlight the shared experiences between nations.
I will always remember this. I took Latin for 4 years in high school. Well, 2.5 years of actual instruction, a year and a half of just fucking around. And the first lines of my first year Latin book were Italia non est insula. Italia è pas insula. Even if you don't know any Latin, the translation is pretty obvious. Italy is not an island. Italy is a peninsula.
I get the vibe. Learning Latin can be pretty dry, but that line sticks with you. It's simple yet makes a clear point. I had a similar experience with a history book that started with an obvious fact. Sometimes those straightforward statements during lessons actually end up being the most memorable. It's funny how the basics become the foundation for everything else later on.
Whenever I hear this one, it always sounds to me like one of those things that can't possibly be true, like would literally every typesetter organize their tools in the same exact way, in cases one on top of the other and the capital letters always on top. Would they all refer to it as the uppercase rather than the top case, or top box, or something else? It sounds almost like one of those stories where the reasoning was tenuously worked into it long after the fact, but there's actually evidence that it was true after all.
It's interesting how some stories stick around, like the one about typesetters and uppercase. I remember talking with a friend who swore by the idea that everything has a simple explanation, even if it sounds outlandish. We spent hours debating it, laughing at how these terms could have developed. In the end, we just accepted that some things are more about tradition than logic.
There are a lot of tautological place names that follow similar patterns, such as the Mississippi River. Mississippi just means big river in Algonquian. So the conversation must have gone something like, what river is that? I don't know, a big river, Mississippi. I guess Mississippi River it is. East Timor, East, and Sahara Desert, Desert, are others.
It's funny how some names end up being repetitive like that. I mean, a river called the Big River just makes you think about how conversations evolve. Imagine naming places today based on what they are. You could end up with something like Mountain, or Lake. It makes you wonder if people ever took a moment to get creative with names or if they just went for the obvious.
The Norman conquest of England, this gives us word pairs like hearty and cordial as well. Of course, cordial is from the French curse, so hearty, and cordial share from the heart connotation. Notice, however, that cordial is more formal, a cordial bow, while hearty is more colloquial, a hearty slap on the back. The subtle difference reflects the fact that cordial was used by Norman aristocrats while hearty was used by Saxon peasants.
It's interesting how language evolves. You can see it in those word pairs. Like cordial, feels more upscale, probably because of its roots with the Normans. Meanwhile, hearty gives off a laid-back vibe, tied to the Saxon peasants. It shows how social class influences what we say. Makes you think about how our backgrounds shape not just our words but also how we connect with each other.
Thanks to 1066, about 1/3 of English vocabulary comes directly from French/Latin. Another third comes from England's later conquests across the planet. Words like leprechaun and pajamas. No English word for that. Well, just use the native name. Thanks to this habit of adopting and incorporating foreign words, English has the largest vocabulary of any language, double that of French, which comes in at number 2.
Languages evolve in interesting ways. I remember a friend who loved exploring different cultures. He often used words from various languages, mixing them into conversations. It was a fun way to learn and connect with others. It also made us think about how much influence other languages have on our own. Just like English absorbing words, he showed that communication can be more than just our native language.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.